Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, Warmer Climates, Migration to the Cloud. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends seeking knowledge and insight for leveraging Microsoft 365 to achieve a successful cloud migration. For folks who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the private sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements. Ryan?
Hey, folks, apologies. And welcome back. Thank you very much, Maggie. I work for a company called Mint, which is a global Microsoft partner, and this is a slide that kind of speaks to some of our highlights. We are very, very prominent in highly regulated industries in all of the territories where we are active. So that is financial services, education, healthcare, and the flavors of government in different territories, which in the US would be federal, state, and local. You can see in the bottom right that we have a large number of gold competencies, which reflect our 20 years of successful partnership with Microsoft, and we specialize in their technologies. Essentially, in everything that we do, we seek to create tomorrow, which is what our slogan is. Next slide, Maggie. Great. Okay, so essentially, the IQ Business Group and Mint have been working together for about 5 or 6 years, building compliance solutions on top of Microsoft technologies. IQ bringing a depth of knowledge which applies to compliance, records management in a technology agnostic manner, and Mint bringing the global Microsoft knowledge that is required to build these types of practices on top of the Office 365 platform. And this webinar is essentially a culmination of experience in the trenches and an opportunity for us to share some of the knowledge that we've gained building these types of solutions, and hopefully is of some value to everybody who's listening in. So as you saw on the previous slide, our methodology that we've developed in partnership, IQ and Mint, is called Smart Compliance. Essentially, it is a set of techniques and methodologies and practices which allow you to build a solid end-to-end turnkey outcome as a service governance, information governance, compliance, records management, and collaboration system on top of Microsoft technologies. Without getting too deep in the weeds, essentially everything that we'll be talking about today is built on some of the experiences that we've had implementing this type of methodology across private and public sector in highly regulated fashion. And essentially, it's what our onion depicts here is that we've recognized that there are proactive and reactive measures that are required in order to build solid information governance. It starts with physical records, which is under a lot of pressure at the moment, with folks with regulations moving away from submission of physical records to digital record submissions only. Pressure to reduce carbon footprints, all of those types of things. We'll talk a little bit about that. But on top of physical records management, there is a need for information architecture, governance of information within that architecture, provision to allow productive collaboration within that architecture, protecting the organization's information, both from a security perspective as well as from an informational perspective, and then a set of services that you need to think about and disciplines that need consideration on top of that. The reason that this is relevant to a discussion about migration is that you'll see, first of all, in the top right-hand segment of the mandala, there is a cloud migration section, and almost all of the discussions that we're having currently with our clients start with a cloud migration discussion. This is not going to be your typical talk on cloud migration, which is how do we get our information from A to B. There are a lot of very good tools that can make that a no-brainer. We work very closely with an organization called AvePoint, who have a fantastic product called AvePoint Fly, which will essentially automate that process in such a way that sitting and having an entire webinar about picking the bits and pieces of how to do that effectively apart is not as valuable as talking about what needs to happen around that migration process. And so that's our focus today.
And now we've got our first poll question. We want to know a little bit more about what your current cloud landscape looks like. So that should be up on your screens right now for you. Okay, looks like we've got everybody in. And then people say they are fully cloud enabled, so good for y'all.
Okay. So hopefully one of the things that you took away from that very complicated and detailed mandala about smart compliance on the previous slide is that cloud migration is just a very small element of that. And in a lot of conversations, when we start to talk about cloud migration in the context of information governance and security and those types of things and regulation, a lot of folks are unsure about whether or not cloud migration is really a thing and the speed at which it's happening. And so I thought a good place to start with our discussion is talking about the growth in cloud adoption. So I've got some statistics here that you can see. There's 100 zettabytes as the total volume of data that will be stored in the cloud by 2025, which accounts for 50% of all the data in the world sitting inside of cloud. 32% on average of total IT budget is currently being allocated to cloud computing or will be within the next year. 54% of current cloud-based applications were moved from from an on-premises environment to the cloud, and so most of what is sitting inside of the cloud currently wasn't purpose-built for the cloud, but is rather something that is migrated to the cloud, and that's a trend that we expect to see continued. And then finally, 81% of organizations already use cloud computing or have applications in the cloud. So that is up from 73% in 2018. This figure is beginning of 2020. And I think that really amplifies what we saw inside of the poll on the previous slide, that a lot of folks either at most have something in the cloud, and that this is no longer a question of if cloud is going to happen, but when cloud is going to happen. Next slide, please, Maggie. Okay, so if we break that down a little bit more without getting too deep into the weed from a statistical perspective, but just to drive the point home, what we are seeing from a growth prediction perspective is that these are the types of workloads that are either currently migrating or deployed into the cloud, planning to migrate in the next 1 to 3 years, and then there's some bits and pieces on the end there. And what you can see is that it's a large number of migrations that are currently or on their way to the cloud. 42% when we're talking about things like storage and archive and backup and file servers. And so at least a portion of almost every organization's information is headed to the cloud. And obviously, when we're talking, this talk is about cloud migration. When we're talking about cloud migration as a principal means for achieving that, again, it's not really about how technically difficult is it to move a few bytes from on-premise to the cloud. It's rather about what is the complication around that actual migration, being we have these information silos on premise, we're trying to get them into the cloud. What does it look like if we take something that has lived on premise for a number of years and move it to the cloud? Should we move it to the cloud? Does it change when it moves? What do we do about security? All of these are the types of things that we're talking about. And then just at the bottom right of the slide, you can see an indication of where we are today and where we expect to be in 18 months in terms of on-premises versus some cloud, mostly on-premises, and some on-premises, mostly cloud. And what you can see there is that within 18 months, most organizations will have some on-premises presence, and that will continue for the next few years at least, but that most of their information will be in the cloud. Next slide. And this is being further complicated, as I'm sure that you would have guessed, by the effects of the pandemic. What we're finding is that as a result of organizations being forced to adopt remote working, they've had to take some steps, and one of the steps that have been taken is an acceleration of cloud adoption, simply because it makes remote working so much easier. And so you see 87% of employers will speed up their cloud migration due to the pandemic. And 70% of employees are excited about the change in their jobs. So folks enjoy working from home. And obviously, as I'm sure you can anticipate, if you are a person who works from home and the records that you generate and the work that you do is largely paper-based, this is going to push additional pressure on the organization to move away from paper-based processes to more modern, automated or digitized processes. And those will as a side effect, produce digital records, obviously. Step.
And we've got another poll. This time we want to know, what are your current issues with the cloud? Are you worried about cost? Are you worried about security, training? We want to know where y'all are at. So it looks like the primary concern is cost control.
And that is a very interesting segue into our next slide in that case. Because the next slide talks about a question. Are we accelerating to cloud at the cost of safety? And what are the costs of this acceleration to remote working, to the cloud, to moving our information? Top of the pops in that regard, as you can see, is controlling cloud costs. And I think that that's viable. But if you look at the next few challenges, top of the list of things that folks are struggling with as part of their cloud migration, it all has to do with either security, governance, compliance, or information management, or the skills to enact those things within the organization. And so what this alludes to is that, first of all, we know that information governance is evolving. It's evolving because we have a collision of different ecosystems into one another. You have the canonical world of the records managers, where information retention and the way that it is classified and the way that it is handled has very precise processes that follow a theory of records management and is taught, and folks in that space, at least in public sector and in highly regulated industries, are very au fait with the fact that they have to manage information in a certain way, and there are systems on premise traditionally which handle those types of things. That world is colliding with this world of collaboration where folks develop content at high velocity, where they do so in a very dispersed fashion, where information is shared backwards and forwards, and essentially where content is developed through its life cycle up to the point where it is declared as a record. And conventionally what would happen is that information would then move into a record system, and movements of records and as they are declared and those types of things are not going away. So although we're hearing a lot of buzzwords about declare in place and those types of things, I think that there are still a few steps that the industry has to go through to get there. But besides the collision of collaboration and records management, there is also a change in the way that we view security. And security is becoming pervasive through all applications. It's expected that there is a single sign-on experience, that it has multi-factor authentication, and that same sign-on can be used in multiple applications. And at the same time, regulations are becoming more and more draconian, and we'll see that on a slide coming up shortly. So what we're saying here is that world that is so complicated, where records management is now, its responsibility is expanding to include collaboration, to include a lot of elements of security which would have fallen outside of its realm of responsibility at a stage. Essentially, that world is now being further complicated by the fact that all of that information is being migrated to a new environment, a new ecosystem with new rules. And that, if you think about it, is a lot of moving parts to consider. And a lot of organizations that we're speaking to have kind of said, well, we'll just move what we have, and we're doing that because we want to change CapEx to OpEx, because we're on end of life hardware, because there's a lot of mitigating factors that would go into that. But hopefully you can see that a lot of the risks around this type of migration are far less about the technicalities of moving the information and far more about the nuances of regulation, compliance, information governance that surround both the on-premise information stores as well as these new cloud stores. Next slide. Okay, and then just some interesting facts, and this is a slide from a previous webinar, so if you've been following us for a while, you may recognize it. There's just a list of fines and breaches that have happened, that have been high profile in the last few years throughout the media. And essentially what this is pointing to is that organizations can't afford to take compliance and regulation lightly. Those organizations that can afford to take these kinds of knocks have been wrapped over the knuckles quite hard, I might add. And these are not just security breaches that we're talking about here. This is not just a hacker who managed to get into the organization's systems. This is also misuse or mismanagement of people's personal information. And it's getting to the point now where folks are in a position in their private capacity to start to think about suing organizations who are not following the correct regulations as far as information is concerned. And likewise within industry, regulations are tightening and becoming more draconian as time goes by. And so the point of this slide is just that the cost and the liability are now so large that organizations can't afford to be lackadaisical about the measures that they put in place for their information. And the process of moving your information to cloud may highlight risks and put them front and center as your information now moves into a more highly available, highly indexed, highly discoverable environment. And so you really need to consider how you build your information management strategy around the data that you're migrating. Okay, and then another favorite slide of ours, talking about the way that organizations handle information today. This may resonate, this may sound like something that you've seen somewhere, this may sound like something that is happening at your own organization. Essentially, we know that information is valuable and that compliance is no longer an optional investment. And perhaps we have records management and a records management schedule and a system that manages that schedule or the information that falls under that schedule. But compliance is low in most business units, meaning that even if there are these measures in place, whether or not a business unit follows the record schedule and puts in place the right processes is perhaps different from business unit to business unit. We see a lot of that. We would like to implement strategic information governance, but the volume is overwhelming. some of the organizations that we've dealt with recently have got 12 years worth of data, terabytes of data, a lot of it for employees who no longer work there, which has grown organically. And so it becomes very, very difficult to figure out how you tackle such a mountain of information when considering things like migrating your information to the cloud. And so what do? We just keep everything by default. And we're not really sure what our liability is. In the image on the right-hand side, in some of those boxes, there's information that is, completely harmless, and in others there are flammable pieces of flammable information, which, if there was ever a fire, would take down the entire storeroom, if I can extend the metaphor. And finally, we could do a better job of maximizing the use of our information. And that is a feeling that we get from most organizations that we deal with inside of our consulting practices. Next slide. And so something else to consider within that storeroom, within that mountain of information that most organizations are having to deal with, and which is growing exponentially. Every year that goes by, that becomes exponentially larger. The problem becomes exponentially more difficult to tackle. Something to realize is that most organizations are, of all the information that they house, only 12% of that is critical data. And that 23% of it is what we call ROT, which is redundant, obsolete, and trivial. And it has a huge cost to manage across the globe in the trillions. And beneath that ROT data is dark data, which is hidden within people's networks on their local laptops. And essentially what this reflects is that it's not necessary to tackle the entire mountain at once. If we could find a way to identify what is the 12% critical data that this organization needs to manage, and which probably contains 80% of our liability, that is a step in the right direction, and just something to think about when you're putting together a strategy for migration. Do you actually want to migrate 100% of your data? And don't get me wrong, in some cases that is completely viable, and migrating it across. But at the very least, you might be able to take some measures to understand how old the data is, who created it, a very broad classification of information which allows you to identify it as business critical, ROT, or dark data, and deal with it appropriately as a result of that. And this can mean that, first of all, your footprint as you move to the cloud is much smaller, but also that your liability is much smaller and your costs are much smaller. And if you're seeking to manage costs in the cloud, this can be a strategy that builds its own ROI in terms of a viable investment up front for your migration strategy. Next slide. Okay, and we spoke about this. This really amplifies what we were talking about on a previous slide, which has to do with the colliding worlds which make up the new information landscape. We spoke about records management systems on the right-hand side, and collaboration systems, your historical intranet, or products like OneDrive, your new teamwork systems like Microsoft Teams, which allow you to create workspaces where folks can collaborate on information. Something to think about: those teamwork workspaces could contain potential records. We've dealt with a few organizations who have, in the face of the pandemic, released teams, allowed folks to create these workspaces. And now, as normality starts to return to our workday, compliance officers and records managers are looking at this sprawl of teams and thinking to themselves, how on earth are we going to get all of this information spread across all of these teams back into some kind of workflow that will allow us to do solid record keeping on it? And so what we're really talking about here is finding a balance. On the left-hand side, you can see a few points that have to do with what happens if you don't have that balance. And what we mean by that is, historically, collaboration and records management were different systems. And so identity was as well. And if an organization focused very heavily on security and identity, it would limit an organization's ability to collaborate, to share information freely. And so it hamstrings one element of this new ecosystem with an over focus on the other, which is not to say that you should ever compromise security and identity. You obviously want to make sure that you are as productive as possible inside of those controls. Likewise, if an organization focuses on collaboration, it enables teamwork, it allows rapid development of content and information in order to make employees as productive as possible, that may be at the cost of compliance and governance. And if this is all happening inside of a cloud environment, it just adds an additional dimension of complication to the entire story.
And we have another poll. Tell us a little bit about how the move to hybrid has changed your thoughts about the cloud. Looks like everyone is considering cloud adoption.
Okay, so having set the scene now in terms of, first of all, cloud adoption, the speed at which it's happening, the fact that a cloud migration strategy is probably something that most organizations need, since most of them are considering moving most of their information to the cloud over the next 5-year period, if they are not already well on their way in terms of that journey. And then, having spoken about the complexity of the ecosystems involved in that migration, whether they are from a records management perspective or a collaboration perspective, the inclusion of things like teamwork, the complications caused by remote working, and the fact that we have dispersed workforces, essentially, this slide now starts to talk about the practical way to tackle something like a migration strategy. And so what you'll see here is we've spoken about the different levels of maturity that we have seen and identified inside of an organization that is looking to get to a point in terms of cloud and using it as a platform to make their operation better. A lot of organizations will take a look at this maturity scale, and their goal is probably somewhere on the top end of it. They might be saying, well, cloud is somewhere where big data happens, and we want to get all of our information into one place so that we're able to draw from each of those individual silos and present a single cliff face of analytics, which will allow us to be properly armed in order to make good business decisions. And that is a very good goal to have, and probably summarizes quite nicely what most organizations would like to have. But it's very, very difficult to just start with that goal in mind. Many organizations may be saying, well, we would like to be more agile in terms of our ability to make business decisions, or we want to be more efficient and drive our costs down, or we want to be completely integrated in terms of all of the systems that we have and have the ability to move information from one system into another system seamlessly, so that we have these workflows which have a very low admin overhead to get a piece of information out of the sales system and into the ERP system, for instance. The fact of the matter is that you probably have to start this journey at the very bottom. And a lot of organizations try to get too many things right at the same time. Either by starting without having gotten all of the right information together in terms of what the roadmap looks like, what the blueprint looks like, what all the mitigating factors are in terms of the systems that are incumbent inside of their ecosystem. Then thinking about things like connectivity, for instance. If you have on-premise data centers and you are starting a cloud journey, how do the systems that will remain on-premise during this hybrid phase, how do they communicate with the cloud? How do we make that most efficient? How do we do that in such a way that it is secure, which leads us into the next level? Once you have these hybrid environments which contain elements of cloud and on-premise systems, and they need to communicate with each other on a continuous basis, and you have a remote workforce which is working with that information, often on devices that aren't owned by the organization, how do you make that safe? And the process of making that safe should be your next goal on top of that. And the next one is compliance, which we've spoken a lot about in previous slides. Starting to look at the process of understanding the regulations that apply to your organization by rote of the industry that it is in, or as a result of the state that it's in, or the territory that it's in, regulations imposed by government, regulations perhaps imposed by other governments or by other states as a result of the fact that companies' customers reside in those states, for instance. There's a lot that has to go into building out a compliance plan, understanding what your responsibilities are in terms of regulation, articulating that in document format as a record schedule and supporting documents, and then obviously putting together a plan to enable an organization to manage the process of becoming compliant and staying compliant. A lot of organizations, it's a really high cost to continuously have external auditors come in and measure the compliance of the organization against XYZ regulation, only to find that 3 months after that audit has happened, there has been some drift in terms of the compliance. And really what we're talking about here is setting up both the cloud environment and elements of the on-premise environment in such a way that this compliance can be continuously measured. Continuous just talks about backup, disaster recovery. How does that work? How do we deal with the fact that things that are on-premise will go to in-cloud? How do we do that without disrupting business productivity and ensuring business continuity, integrating all of those systems together, whether they are in the cloud or on-premise. And I don't want to get too far into this now. There are obviously elements at every single level that you would want to consider. Hopefully what you can see and what you can take away here is that there are layers to a cloud strategy, and migration needs to pay respect to those layers as well. Doing something like moving all of the information into the cloud without considering, once it lands there, who has access to what, the identities or the folks who have permission to access certain files in an on-premise file share might look very different to who has access to files once it actually moves to the cloud. These are the types of things that you would want to make sure that you have in place. And so the process of migrating can be quite complex, because it means that you have to put a lot of measures in place in order to ensure that the evolving ecosystem of the organization is well prepared to handle the migrated information wherever it may land, and also to continue to service the hybrid information stores which may continue to be available on premise as this process happens over a number of years. Okay. And ultimately, we all want to get to the point where our organizations are insightful. Okay, next slide, Maggie. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we're going to take a bit of a step back and think about some of the layers that we saw on the previous slide, because they really have to do with information. And when we're talking about cloud migration, although there was a lot of elements of the last slide that are important when you're considering that, how systems integrate with one another, how things are connected. These are IT concerns. And what we really want to focus on when we're talking about this cloud migration process are the information governance concerns. There are different elements to that we need to consider. On previous slides, we were talking about the fact that there's a liability that exists, that liability is being exposed, and it's evolving continuously as different regulatory bodies evolve the compliances that they have put together in order to ensure that organizations dealing with one another inside of this connected ecosystem can do so in a sane manner, and that an individual's information is properly protected. The elements to a strategy to manage risk inside of the cloud really has 3 parts. The one right at the bottom is risk management, obviously, and that involves determining the areas exposed to risk and the size of the liability. And in many cases, a lot of organizations don't know what their liability size is. And certainly we want to, as we move to the cloud, we want to start to understand what the size of that liability is and where the most risk-centered areas are. On the top of, once we have an idea of what the risks are and what their liability size is, we can start to put things in place in order to govern those. And that's the realms of governance, managing risks according to organizational strategy. And then finally, compliance or tactical actions that are put in place in order to mitigate the risks. And often those will be against a formal compliance standard that comes from a regulatory body. So these are the elements that we're talking about that are important when considering how to migrate and how to manage the information once it is migrated. Next slide, please. Okay, so I love this slide. This comes from the folks at Deloitte who are discussing this GRC strategy is essentially governance and risk and compliance. And the reason that I love this infographic is because the green circle in the middle that is protected from the outside world, and we've got lightning strikes and all sorts of adverse weather happening outside of the organization. That's really what our view of the organization was from an IT perspective. If you rewound 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we felt that we could ring fence our organization as if it were a castle with a moat around it, and essentially protect our information that way. And in a lot of cases, that may have been the case because an organization may have had a single headquarters or have all of their information inside of a single data center. But I think that those days are gone. And that what we're finding with most organizations, and this is depicted here, if you look at the buildings outside of our circle of protection on the right-hand side, which are essentially our remote workers, branches that are spread across our territories. Essentially, as organizations become a lot more dispersed, it becomes much more difficult to have a centralized strategy for things like security and information governance and so forth. Instead, those measures have to travel with the information. They have to travel with the folks who are working on the information. And so inside of our green circle here, you can see at the bottom are our crown jewels, the information, the intellectual property of the organization, the things that are our differentiators, the information that we don't want to have exposed to outside sources. And then you can see outside of that, there's a whole lot of things that are seeking to, I suppose, alleviate the organization of their crown jewels. But inside of that, you can see that there's a lot of that's happening in terms of automation, IoT, RPA, all of these are buzzwords that we hear a lot of. But there are more subtle things that are happening as well. Now, we are talking about digitization of physical records. We are talking about modernization of business processes so that they are working on digital information rather than physical information. We're talking about simple information workflows that include a digital signature. These are the types of things that we are seeing more and more prevalent inside of organizations in terms of the way that they work with their crown jewels or the information that is most important to them. And then you have a lot of evolving SaaS systems that sit on top of that are all on their way to the cloud, things like ERP systems, sales systems, finance systems, etc. And on top of that, you have risks and controls and assurances and all sorts of things that would form the basis of a GRC strategy. And essentially what we're talking about here are the measures that we can take in order to put a strategy like this in place as a platform within which migration can happen. And that's really essentially a much larger task than how do we get the bits and bytes from the file share on premise into the cloud and their new home. Next slide. Okay, and so this is an example of how you might go about developing a GRC program. This is something that should be a precursor to any migration efforts. Essentially, we're talking about putting this framework in place and then doing the migration within this framework. And the different pillars that we would want to consider include, as we said, risk management. So you would want to align and adapt risk management program to the organization's cloud strategy. You want to identify, analyze, and evaluate internal and external cyber risks. You want to optimize your risk portfolio and risk treatments. You want to continuously monitor, measure, and adapt your risk management program. And this risk management pillar should be in place. You should be something that every organization has when it looks at its information portfolio, which allows it to understand where the risk is. Consider, if you will, that if an organization is considering moving 20 terabytes of information from on-premise to the cloud, and they don't have a risk management process for that information, and they don't have a risk register that identifies the liability inside of that information, that could be a problem. You also want a governance framework. This governance framework is not just about developing the security policies that are necessary and information governance policies, but also how do we make governance easy by putting in place a proper information taxonomy, and then layering on top of that something that will do things like auto classification, which will help us know where governance is needed in terms of our ecosystem. And then finally, the operationalized compliance framework, which are the controls, processes, and programs which are needed in order to ensure that we deliver on our objectives in terms of what we've seen, what we've strategically decided in terms of governance as a result of our risks. And so, you know, a lot of things to consider when considering migration. Next slide, please, Maggie. Okay, and so here is a different take on the timeline of thinking about how to tackle cloud migration sensibly, and really the culmination of all of the information that we've given you in this webinar, which is hopefully something to think about when considering your own migration strategy. It should start with analysis. You want to really understand where your silos of information reside, whether they're, you know, a data center, different branches sitting on premise, on people's laptops, whatever the case may be. You can use AI to identify sensitive information. You can use you want to document your compliance and regulatory landscape, and you want your organizational policies and record schedule to be up to date. So really what we're talking about is getting all of that information together and analyzing it and having all of that stuff on the table before you start to strategize how you will approach your migration. From here, you need things, as you strategize, you want to know what your retention strategy looks like, what your compliance roadmap looks like, what your migration strategy will be, as in actually getting the files from where they currently reside into the cloud, for instance. Disaster recovery, what happens if something goes wrong during the process? What happens if something goes wrong in the cloud? In a lot of cases, your cloud tenant may be resilient to disaster and have, you know, a secondary copy of all information in an alternate region. Those are things that you would want to understand. And then finally, your information strategy. This stuff all sounds very self-evident, but we deal with a lot of organizations where this isn't formally addressed up front. And the failure to do these types of things can end up with difficulties, such as we've got a retention strategy that says we have to keep X number of records for such a period. That is managed inside of an on-premise records management system. That records management system will continue to stay on-premise for the next 5 years. We've migrated all of our information to the cloud. How do we get that information back into our RM system now? And these are the kind of things that you want to make sure you strategized out before you actually pull the trigger on a migration. Then you want to plan your migration. So besides migration, perhaps digitization is something that you want, that needs to be considered as well. Perhaps there is a storeroom that is full of physical records that need to be digitized, and that needs to form part of the migration. Information governance, and then finally compliance as well. Once you have your plan in place, then the actual implementation of the framework around the information that's going to be migrated should be enacted. That includes putting together your information architecture. So what you may find is that if you are like some of our customers and you've got 20 years worth of information that has grown organically on the, you know, the file share that everyone uses for their files, and you take the time to properly analyze and strategize and plan this out, and you have an information architecture, and this is what you want the information to look like when it gets to the cloud, what you're really doing is you're making use of a great opportunity to change the way that information is managed inside of the organization. Putting that information architecture in place inside of your cloud system then gives you the opportunity to use the migration as an opportunity to better classify, store, segment all of the information within the system in which it will land. And then things like, what does your content ecosystem look like? So how do folks develop their information? Where does that happen? Does it happen inside Microsoft Teams? Does it happen inside of SharePoint? Are folks culturally used to developing this content on their laptop? If that is the case, then there is a shift that will happen as folks start to become more comfortable with creating their content inside of the cloud. What system integrations are required? So here we're talking about the fact that if there is this on-premise records management system that is going to continue to be the system of record as far as retention is concerned, then you need to consider, well, how do we get our files from SharePoint Online, for instance, into that system at a point in time? Perhaps there is a Microsoft Teams instance for a project, and that project is being closed off. When that project is closed off, some of the information potentially goes to a central team where it can be reused on future projects, and some of the information is then shipped into that the existing records management system, and that would require a system integration, and that should be implemented before the migration actually happens, obviously. Centers of excellence and communities of practice. These are institutions within the organization which will assist in making sure that as the migration happens, as the evolution of information management happens within an organization, that it is done according to best practice and that it is done with the right consulting at each step of the way, so that this process is not just a shift of information, but it's a shift of culture and a shift of the way that we approach information. And then, all the policies and processes should be in place if you're going to take advantage of automation, which you should, because automating information workflows is a great way to justify an ROI on a migration. As you get to the cloud and as you implement these automations, you'll find that the cost of expediting certain information workflows will go down. And that gives you a good case for building a return on investment business case for your stakeholders if you're looking to justify this migration. And finally, at the bottom of our implement square, we actually pull the trigger, and it's here that you would use a great tool like perhaps AvePoint Fly, and you would migrate all of this information across to its new home inside of the cloud. And this may happen over a long period of time, obviously. I say pull the trigger, but you're probably not going to have this happen at the speed of a bullet. And then finally, at the back of that migration, there are things to consider about how to operationalize the organization to take advantage of this new information ecosystem. How does e-discovery work inside of the cloud environment now that we've moved? What about PII and how do we address that? What type of analytics exist in order for us to identify these types of information inside of a new cloud ecosystem? What about workspaces for different business units? How do we, once we've moved our information, what does day one look like for each individual business unit, which probably work with information in very different ways? What does it look like for them? How do they adapt to the new normal? What kind of adoption and support do they need from a training perspective and a digital enablement perspective to make sure that this is a successful journey? And finally, change management, which really falls into line with that as well. It's not just about moving information, it's about a shifting culture. It's about ensuring that everything is set up for success in terms of the organization and its employees and the way that they interact with information as this migration happens, and that their business continuity is unaffected as a result of this migration as well. A much more complicated picture than most folks think about when they talk about cloud migration, and hopefully something that resonates with all of the listeners on the call. Okay, next slide, Maggie. I think we're wrapping up. Okay, and then so part of what we're doing in order to assist organizations who are on this journey and to impart some of the knowledge that we have gained in building out these types of systems and performing successful cloud migrations is that we have a workshop offer that we would like to extend to everybody who has given us an hour of their time and listened to me ramble on about all of the migration pieces. We would like to offer all of you the opportunity to take advantage of a 4-hour workshop. Essentially, it's on a first come, first serve basis, and it's not all in one 4-hour session. There are a number of sessions that will spread out over the course of a week. But essentially, we provide as part of that a pre-workshop survey, information analysis, which includes on-premise and cloud, an evaluation of your records management maturity, cloud migration roadmap, some information governance and compliance blueprints, and a lot of things that will help folks perform the analysis that we were talking about that should be the start of every migration journey. And so if this is something that you are busy with inside of your own organization, please reach out to us. There is no cost. We will happily come and assist you with a workshop in order to get you guys onto your journey as painlessly as possible.
So it's time for Q&A. Ryan, we've got time for a couple if you're up for it.
I am indeed.
First one, where did the statistics you displayed come from? I believe that was in reference to one of the earlier slides about cloud.
Yes, okay, so it comes from a few places. There is a state of cloud report that gets published by IDG on an annual basis. Most of the statistics came from the most recent one of those. Some of the other places that we got some of the information is from Deloitte and from Forbes and from Microsoft.
All right, and next up, on the slide where you spoke about rot and dark data, it sounded like you were suggesting that an organization should only migrate some of their data. Is that accurate?
Yes, so, well, not in all cases. So I suppose the way to think about it is that you have a metric ton of information that needs to move across. Within that metric ton of information, you have information that may or may not be classified. If you're like most organizations, the bulk of that is not classified. It may have information from employees who no longer work there. There may be stuff that the record schedule says should have been dispositioned or deleted, which is not, which means that there's inherent liability. And essentially an organization that's looking to try and move that metric ton, maybe going, it's too big a task, let's just move it all and we'll figure it out one day when we have more time, or one day when the cloud has evolved. And the fact of the matter is that a very basic analysis. So yes, you can go and do a detailed analysis of what that information is, and you can make some decisions around that. But essentially, if you can just classify it as rot, dark data, or business critical. And if that business critical, like is the case for most organizations, only represents 12% of that information, you may be able to stagger your migration in such a way that you can, first of all, build a good framework for that business critical data inside of the cloud, migrate that information which is most critical across, and then find a way to tackle the rest of the information. And what you may find in the process of doing that is that not all of it needs to go across, and that there are some decisions that you can make as you work through it. But essentially, as long as your business critical data has gone across, and as long as you've taken the steps as we've described here to put governance, compliance, and risk management in place in the place that business data will land, you've really set yourself up for a good, put yourself in a good position, and done that at a fraction of the cost that it would have taken to move everything.
Okay. And this next question is about the workshop. Who is the free 4-hour workshop aimed at? Is it for records managers or IT people?
Good question. So it's actually a mix. Essentially, we can't have an information governance discussion or a migration discussion without involving IT people, and a lot of the topics that are involved in the process of understanding how to best migrate are IT topics. So portions of the workshop series include tracks that are specifically for IT folks. We also have pieces that are for business stakeholders and are really meant to assist in building the business case for strategic members of the organization who would need to understand the benefits of an information governance strategy across the org. And finally, records managers, compliance officers, and folks who work with information on a day-to-day basis are obviously most impacted by this type of strategy. And so they are certainly front and center in the process, within the workshop as well.
All right. And last one. I've seen solutions that use AI to decide what to move to the cloud. Are these solutions viable?
Yes and no. So I think that AI is a fantastic tool for segmenting your metric ton of information that we were talking about. If you can use AI to look at the shape of the data and to identify information that is likely sensitive or likely part of that 12% of business critical information, that process is money well spent, because it means that you don't have to manually, or some poor human doesn't have to go through that stuff and try and understand what the classification of all of that information is. So AI is certainly a fantastic tool for that. Do I think that something like AI can get that 100% right? No. It may be able to identify all the social security numbers, or it may be able to identify patterns of information which would show it all the invoices or all the contracts. Those types of things are good, but you still need domain experts who understand the shape of the information that the organization works with. And in the process of building out a taxonomy, you would then understand what type of information is most important. And then you would want to work out how you can tackle all of the legacy information with a view on migrating it. And that migration should really take into account the sensitivity of the information, the reusability of the information, the need for that information to be discoverable once it reaches the cloud, the liability of that information, all of those types of things.
All right. And we would like to thank everybody for attending this webinar. We really enjoy putting these on, and we hope y'all get a lot out of them. And we would also like to invite you to the next one. Be on the lookout for the recording of this webinar, which will be out in about 24 hours. There will be a link to register for the next one in that email. And we hope y'all join us again. Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.